He was just a corporate slave, grinding away 78 hours a week for some small-time company. Then one day, he got reborn as a noble in a fantasy world. Sounds like a good deal, right? And it was, until he realized his character trait was being completely illiterate and that he had no special abilities whatsoever. Still, he couldn't really complain. He got to eat all kinds of delicious food, to the point that even he was surprised by how good everything tasted. After his meal, the maid asks if he's finished and offers to assist him with his bath before he retires for the night. He agrees, enjoying the luxury. And so, the MC continues living as the useless son of a count who does nothing but eat and play every day. It's a peaceful, comfortable life, exactly the kind he always dreamed of. But deep down, he can't shake the thought that he doesn't actually know where he is. One evening, the maid tells him that the other young masters will be returning tomorrow and advises him to go to bed early. The MC pauses and asks what she means by young masters. The maid explains that she's referring to young Master Leo and young Master Tonio, as if it should be obvious. She even comments that he's speaking like someone who's never heard of the Palacio family. But in truth, he really hasn't. He repeats the name slowly, Palacio, and thinks to himself that it sounds ominously familiar. The maids look surprised when he sinks his face into the bathwater, lost in thought. He suddenly realizes something and mutters that this place might actually be Psychedelia. Psychedelia, a turn-based RPG he used to play back when he was still a corporate slave. He remembers how, no matter which route he took, once the 5 great sins appeared, wrath, greed, sloth, pride, and obsession, the entire kingdom would begin to fall apart. Nobles, cities, everything would descend into ruin. Among those doomed places was Palacio County, home to Leo Palacio, the so-called king of debauchery, Antonio Palacio, family of corrupt nobles who only appeared in a side quest before the main storyline. Now, standing here, he finally understands where he is. This isn't just a random noble household. It's the very same side quest called Investigate the Palacio County of the Asteria Kingdom. The county is involved in all kinds of shady dealings and runs a dark organization named Avalon. Even back in the game, the place had given him an ominous feeling. And now, he's standing right in the middle of it. The MC stares blankly at his surroundings and mutters in disbelief, asking if this is really happening. Of all places, he's ended up in Palacio County, the very first family in the kingdom to be completely annihilated. Still, he remembers that the subquests here gave a ton of experience in the game. That's some small consolation, but he can't bring himself to like his current situation, being Alan Palacio, the third son and a side villain of the doomed Palacio family. Once he realizes this, he starts praying every day, begging to be sent back. He pleads, saying he'd rather go back to being a corporate slave working 78 hours a week. What's the point of this fancy life if he's just going to die in 10 years anyway? He even thinks it feels worse than when his pay was withheld for 6 whole months. Alan breaks down, complaining that he's supposed to be a transmigrator, yet he didn't get a single special perk. He grumbles to himself, wondering why every other MC in these kinds of stories gets some kind of cheat ability, but not him. Then a thought hits him. Maybe he does have something. Knowing the events of the game 10 years from now is basically the same as knowing the future. If that's the case, all he has to do is eliminate the causes of the kingdom's destruction ahead of time. Determined, he decides that if he wants to live a peaceful, comfortable life as a noble, he'll have to reform the 5 great sins themselves. They're still just children right now, so maybe it's possible even if he's completely powerless. 2 months later, one of his men comes to report. The man tells Alan that he's rescued the orphans from the Eastern Orphanage, or more accurately, from a human experimentation site. Among them, he's placed a girl named Yusha in charge of running the new orphanage. The man is Ivan, Alan's personal knight. Alan nods and tells him that his judgment was correct, calling him very capable. Ivan looks a little uncertain and asks if that was meant to be a compliment, since Alan's face barely changes when he speaks. Alan admits that's true and tells Ivan he's counting on him, forcing a small, desperate smile this time. Ivan hesitates and says he's not sure he'll ever get used to seeing that. Alan looks at himself in the mirror afterward, thinking that his old face used to be much more expressive. Now, it's like his soul hasn't quite synced with his facial muscles. Ivan, still unsure, thanks Alan for the compliment anyway. In a world like Psychedelia, where betrayal is the norm, Ivan is one of the rare supporting characters who stays loyal until the end. The moment Alan found him, he made sure to hire him. Then Ivan brings up the raid again, mentioning that Alan had said it was to rescue the girl Yusha. Alan confirms that's right. Ivan nods thoughtfully and adds that he can definitely see why Alan decided to place his trust in her. Even after all his years as a mercenary, Ivan could tell that the girl was anything but ordinary. ordinary. He still remembered how he found her, so powerful that it didn't make sense for someone like her to quietly stay imprisoned. Ivan tells Alan that there's nothing to gain by leaving her there and suggests bringing her over instead. Alan agrees that his point is sound, but in his mind, he's already made up his mind. It may look like he's wasting her potential, but keeping her there is actually part of his plan. Yusha Bludia, the girl in question, isn't just any child. She's one of the Blood Clan, a being bound by a pact with something indescribably otherworldly. In the game, she would grow up to become the Sin of Wrath, one of the 5 great sins, and the cause of hundreds of thousands of deaths. But Alan believes that if she can grow up in a peaceful environment this time, she won't become part of the ruin. With that, he considers the first landmine taken care of. The reason he left her there was to quietly observe her condition and make sure she's stable. Trying to cover up his thoughts, Alan clears his throat and says out loud that it's something like that, leaving Ivan confused. Then he adds that the time isn't right yet. Ivan looks surprised and repeats his words, asking what he means by not right. Alan simply tells him to make sure nothing about this leaks out and to see that the orphanage receives generous support. Ivan nods seriously, saying he understands. Before Ivan leaves, Alan hands him a sealed envelope and tells him to give it to Yusha. When Ivan asks if the contents are important, Alan replies that it's just a letter of greeting, something to calm her down after everything she went through. Ivan seems impressed that Alan would go as far as to write such a letter and promises to deliver it safely before riding off on his horse. As Alan watches him disappear into the distance, he sighs and admits to himself that he doesn't know if the letter will actually calm her down, but he has to try. What Ivan doesn't know is that the greeting letter carries a hidden message, one Alan remembers from his many playthroughs of psychedelia. The Archbishop Seer had once explained that this was a spell meant to befriend members of the Blood Clan. It was said to have a calming effect on them. The key phrase reads, "Companion of Darkness, Tomb of Light, one hope and one belonging." In the original game, this line appeared during the Sin of Wrath storyline, a part filled with chaos and tragedy. And no matter what choices the player made, the girl would always end up saying, "It's too late." That's when the battle would begin. But now, Alan finds himself 10 years before all of that happens. This time, maybe, just maybe, it's not too late. Alan leans back in his chair and mutters to himself that, with one of the 5 destruction flags now handled, it's time to figure out who's next. He chuckles dryly, thinking that befriending a monster with just a single phrase sounds utterly ridiculous. Still, since the Blood Clan worships some otherworldly being, maybe it could actually work. He sighs, musing that the minds of those who live in the realm of fanaticism are truly beyond understanding. Meanwhile, Ivan, still near the orphanage, can't shake off the feeling of unease. He can sense traces of demonic energy lingering in the air, so dense it's almost suffocating. Even after years of battle, it's something that makes him tense. He thinks to himself that the amount of energy coming from that child is absurd, and she seems strangely emotionless for someone her age. At that moment, Yusha, holding the letter, asks coldly if the one who sent it was Lord Alan. When Ivan confirms, she frowns and asks why he didn't summon her to his side instead. Her tone grows sharper, and the air around her begins to distort. Ivan feels a chill run down his spine. What he's seeing shouldn't even be possible. Visualizing demonic energy is something only those who've reached master level can do. He realizes that Alan's words, "the time is not yet right," might have been more literal than he thought. Trying to defuse the tension, Ivan nods quickly and says that's exactly what Alan meant. The time hasn't come yet. Yusha studies him quietly, then softens her gaze and says she understands. She looks back at the letter, and her eyes catch the final line, "Companion of Darkness, Tomb of Light, one hope and one belonging." For a moment, her expression changes. She presses the letter to her chest, a faint smile crossing her lips as she says that this must be a promise only her master would know. She claims to understand, at least roughly, what it means. Ivan, watching this, is once again struck speechless. The girl standing before him is no ordinary orphan. She's the Sin of Wrath, the daughter of the monstrous blood Yusha, the Bloody Queen. And yet, she now carries a trace of warmth in her eyes. Back in his mansion, Alan stretches and prepares for bed, completely unaware of the storm of emotion his letter has stirred. He murmurs to himself that it was a fulfilling day, one spent extending his cushy, comfortable life. Looking out the window, he even jokes that the bright moon seems to be cheering him on. Satisfied, he smiles faintly and says he'll have to work just as hard on the next one. And with that, he finally drifts off to sleep. We see Alan rummaging through shelves and piles of old papers, clearly frustrated. He mutters that there's nothing here either, grumbling that finding a clue for the third boss is such a pain. Just then, Ivan enters and reports that they've successfully rescued the second child Alan had mentioned. Alan perks up a little and asks asks if they treated the child kindly, extra gently even. Ivan assures him they did, explaining that they rescued the child from an illegal slave market. Before Alan can respond, the study doors suddenly burst open with a loud crash. Standing in the doorway is none other than Tonio Palacio, the Count's second son. Tonio strolls in with his usual swagger, greeting Alan with a mocking grin. He smirks and comments that seeing an illiterate fool like Alan holding a book is a rare sight. Then, narrowing his eyes, he reminds Alan that he's heard about his recent attempts to learn to read. With a serious expression, he demands an answer, telling Alan that his big brother is talking. Alan thinks to himself how much of a pain Tonio always is and wonders how the original Alan ever managed to put up with him. He'd love to fight back, but he knows he can't. So instead, he bows politely and says that if his brother wishes to use the study, he'll take his leave. Tonio sneers and says that at least Alan knows his place, pressing his hand firmly on top of Alan's head, as if to humiliate him. But before things can escalate, something whizzes past them. A knife embeds itself into the wall beside Tonio. A calm but chilling voice follows. The insects are being noisy. Both of them turn to see another figure standing in the doorway. It's Leo Palacio, the eldest son of the Count. Leo sighs and says he doesn't want to see blood this early in the day, ordering both of them to scram. Tonio bristles and fires back, suggesting that if Leo insists on entering the study, maybe he should leave the stench of the rabble outside. Leo, clearly annoyed, tells him to stop stinking up the place and to get lost, adding a cold "now." Alan stays perfectly still, his mind racing. In the game, the Palacio family had only been minor side characters who vanished early on, but in reality, their presence and power feels far more dangerous than he ever imagined. He remembers Leo, the king of debauchery, who rules the underworld like a crime lord. Tonio, the king of stuff, who runs an enormous cartel. These two are scoundrel brothers locked in a brutal struggle over the family seat. If Alan wants to survive and keep his cushy, comfortable life, he knows he must never provoke either of them. So, without a word, he carefully slips out of the room while the brothers continue their heated argument behind him. As he walks away, he thinks to himself that he'll happily live as a weak and incompetent illegitimate child if it means staying out of trouble. Later, Ivan approaches him again and mentions that the second child they rescued wasn't exactly ordinary either. But by this point, Alan is too exhausted to even react. He just sighs, already dreading whatever new chaos this not ordinary child might bring next. Ivan wonders how someone like Alan manages to uncover secret biological experiments and illegal slave markets just to save children. He thinks Alan looks barely able to take care of himself. Sitting on a couch seems to drain him, but still tells him that he's peculiar. He also notes that Alan plans to send the rescued child to an orphanage. Alan grimly thinks that the child is far worse than not ordinary. She's a world-ending catastrophe. This girl was rescued from the illegal slave market of the Callian Kingdom, one of the central nations in the Union. In the game, this was the route tied to Deuce Macrian, the second boss. Sold into slavery, passed from place to place and abused, that child would eventually become the sin of sloth among the 5 great sins and wipe out kingdoms in the most horrific way. That brutal chapter terrified players. Despite the title, the sin of sloth was a tireless monster who returned harm 1,000-fold. Alan remembers repeatedly telling Ivan to treat the rescued children well. When Ivan asks why he sent the child to an orphanage, Alan clears his throat and says the reason is that the time isn't right. Ivan then asks whether the letter Alan sent to Yusha was about the second child. Alan replies that the note was just light banter, an attempt to be friendly and to ask her to look after the troubled child he was sending. He explains it as everyday chatter, nothing more. But wherever Alan goes, people sense something broken in him, the mark left by the black goat, and they notice it. Yusha, holding the letter, tells him that the Great Moon has chosen someone like him and congratulates him. She urges him to feel the power he's been given and to unleash what's rightfully his, promising that if he devotes himself to serving her, he can have his revenge. Yusha reads the letter aloud, noting how it starts with a light-hearted tone. A simple greeting, followed by, "Yusha, I hope you're well. I'm doing fine myself. My second brother used me as a chair again today. Haha, amusing, isn't it? I'd like to exchange letters from time to time. Please reply if you're amenable. As for the child I sent this time," after reading it, she remarks that she should send her first reply soon. Meanwhile, Alan is busy investigating the location of the third boss when Ivan rushes in, clearly agitated. He announces that there's a huge problem. The young master, Tonio, is dead. Alan looks up sharply and asks what he means. Ivan repeats that the scoundrel is dead. Alan can hardly believe it. Already, he wonders, just as preparations for the funeral are underway. At the funeral, the atmosphere is grim but not solemn. The count attends with women on each arm. Some guests whisper about being bored, while others complain about being hungry. Alan listens, inwardly disgusted. Coming to your son's funeral high and flaunting women like trophies? He was messed up, sure, but this feels like something straight out of a dark fantasy novel. Still, Alan finds Tonio's death peculiar. In the game, Tonio's death happens much later, after years of torment, at the hands of someone who triumphantly declares, "I finally killed that vermin." That same person then boasts, "Finally, my body has become the undisputed heir Count Palarshu." Alan recalls how dramatically that man had cried about his suffering, yet now he stands there with a satisfied grin, as if reveling in his newfound fortune. Alan concludes that the culprit is either Leo or someone loyal to him. Either way, his main focus remains to eliminate the 5 great sins. A year passes. The succession issue is settled. Leo now heads the family business, and the Palarshu household seems to enjoy a rare period of peace. During this time, Alan and Yusha become regular correspondents, their steady exchange of letters building a useful rapport. In her most recent letter, Yusha writes that the children are all doing well. Yuna excels at tag, Haydn loves playing war games, and Deuce constantly performs little plays. They're growing up happy and healthy. Alan smiles at the letter and remarks that they sound like good kids. Then he checks the attached sponsor list for the month. After scanning through it, he frowns slightly and mutters, "Huh? The number of sponsors has increased again. It's strange for such a small orphanage to keep getting more and more backers." Ivan mentions that the rising number of sponsors is unusual, though certainly a good sign. Then he remembers something and adds that there's news regarding the matter Alan had been investigating so intently. The Information Guild has finally found a clue. Alan's expression brightens. He says it's a relief and inwardly thinks that this must be about the third boss. Finally, some progress. That evening feels perfectly calm, quiet, peaceful, almost idyllic. And then chaos erupts. Screams echo through the air as panic spreads across a place called Merrick, one of the main distribution hubs. 2 men step out of a warehouse, chatting casually. One of them comments on how generous the eldest Palarshu son is, praising the incredible rewards. The other agrees, boasting that their organization has already grown to several hundred members and will continue to expand. But before they can finish their conversation, they freeze. In front of them lie countless bodies sprawled on the ground. The men quickly draw their weapons, fear gripping them as people around begin to convulse. Someone shouts, "No, my hand is moving on its own." Others scream for help, their bodies twisting unnaturally. "Save me, save me," they cry, but no help comes. Their limbs move as if controlled by an unseen force, turning the scene into a nightmarish puppet show. Amid the horror, in a dimly lit area nearby, 2 shadowy figures watch. One of them remarks that they enjoyed today's puppet show and notes that the list of sponsors to report has increased. The other questions the purpose of these actions, asking why the first seems to pity the victims. The first figure replies coldly that those people were vile, individuals who ground human beings to create their wares. But even so, they fail to see how this massacre serves their own revenge. Yusha steps into the light then, her voice calm and assured. She explains that of course it serves a purpose. These events are laying the foundation for his return. When he arrives, she says, would it do for his place to be shabby? The others seem to understand now. The grim work continues, everything moving in silence and precision. And so, from the shadows, everything proceeds according to his will, for the blue moon itself has become his sword. It had been 2 full years since Alan started exchanging letters with Yusha. One quiet afternoon, Ivan returned from a trip and found Alan in the backyard. He told Alan he had been out there, and Alan admitted that Ivan had startled him. Ivan reported that the 5th child had been safely sent to the orphanage, which meant that Alan had successfully rescued all 3 remaining sins during that time. Alan handed Ivan some food and told him to eat, which Ivan accepted gratefully. Alan reflected that finding the 3rd child, tied to the sin of greed, had been a bit of a struggle, but thanks to his game knowledge and by pushing Ivan to work hard, everything had worked out. He tossed a few more pieces of food to Ivan, who eagerly caught them all without dropping a single one. He praised Ivan for all his hard work and told him he could rest now. Ivan asked if that meant the orphanage missions were finished, and Alan confirmed that they were. Ivan said it was a relief, and then asked if Alan was happy. Alan said that he was, but Ivan noted that he still didn't show it. Alan explained that he was smiling and tried to put on a slightly bigger smile. Ivan, unconvinced, said he supposed it was true. Later, as Alan lay down, he thought about how smoothly everything had gone. The bosses of Psychedelica had become the 5 great sins due to their tragic pasts, and even though this world existed before they awakened as sins, the odds of saving all of them before their fates turned dark had been low. He had worried that he might end up rescuing them only after they were completely broken. Alan asked Ivan how the orphanage was doing. Ivan handed him a letter and told him that everything was running smoothly. The children who had been like broken dolls at first had brightened up significantly. Alan read the letter and noted that, with Yusha handling things so well, they didn't even need a caretaker. He thought about Yusha's unexpectedly competent management and realized that perhaps her connection to the orphanage had made her well-suited for the role. Looking at it this way, he concluded that Yusha was a good kid too. Ivan asked if there was anything noteworthy in the letter. Alan read that everyone was doing well. Some of the children were growing up wonderfully, and Deuce in particular had improved so much that there was no reason to worry about him. Alan said that it made him happy to see the children thriving and admitted that, for some reason, he felt proud. Finally, in his thoughts, Alan reflected that all 5 sins were growing up normally. He realized that the environment really did make a difference. Ivan asks Alan when he actually plans to meet the children, noting that Alan always says, "when the time comes." Alan hesitates, and in his mind admits that he never planned to meet them in person. He reasons that while building a closer relationship with them could be useful, the process of them becoming sins had been horrific. Even from the in-game flashbacks, their personalities had been extreme from childhood. Since he saved them before awakening, it's probably safer now, but still intimidating. Alan says that maybe 5 years later would be the right time to meet them. Ivan nods and adds that now he just needs to build up enough self-defense skills. Alan, thinking to himself, notes that surviving in this dark fantasy world requires talent and magic, and fortunately, this body has it. Ivan then asks if Alan has ever heard of Blue Moon. Alan pretends ignorance, saying he hasn't. Ivan explains that it's a newly famous organization that hunts down criminal groups. Alan comments that it sounds like they're cleaning up trash and doing good work, though he recalls that he doesn't remember such an event in the game, assuming it was probably short-lived. Ivan adds that they also target nobles, which is why he thought Alan might have heard of them. Alan decides that from tonight onward, Ivan will sleep in the room next to his. Later that night, a meeting takes place, with people discussing Blue Moon's weekly activities. Yusha reports that the North is handled, and Sealang, Pride Sin, explains that she completed her mission flawlessly. She mentions that no one discovered her identity thanks to an outfit Ryan had made. She even recounts how the enemy would have spared her if she revealed her eye color, but no one knew. Another operative asks about Greed Sin, Ryan, and says that all associated threats were thoroughly eliminated. Someone else reports that the South is taken care of, including the illegal human experiment site and the troublesome Avalon agents. Everything has been wiped clean without a trace. This operative is Leaden Purity Sin. Yusha confirms that everything is proceeding according to Alan's will, emphasizing that their actions exist for the Great Moon. This reveals the true nature of Blue Moon, a secret cult of worshippers devoted to the Great Moon. Then, one of the members hesitates and points out that there's a problem. Yusha, surprised, questions how there could be a problem under his will, expecting that everything should be perfect. One of the operatives points out that Avalon's leader is actually the Count's eldest son. During the southern cleanup, they had discovered a dangerous directive. It seemed the Count's son was plotting against his father. Yusha grows furious upon hearing this and confirms that it's true. She recalls the letter instructing, after the aging Count dies, poison him quietly. She can hardly believe it, but she acknowledges that it is indeed correct. 2 years pass. The Count Polarshu is finally dead, with the official cause listed as a heart attack. Alan thinks that, given the Count's excessive lifestyle, the outcome wasn't surprising. Some others mention Blue Moon again, reporting that they had ambushed the area the previous night. Another total annihilation. Alan notes to himself that even Avalon is now taking Blue Moon seriously. The Count's funeral passes quietly, without a single mourner. Ivan asks Alan what he plans to do next, reminding him that next year the eldest, the first young master, will officially become head of the family. Alan notices luggage stacked nearby and tells Ivan to pack as well. Ivan is shocked, asking if they are leaving the territory. Alan clarifies that they aren't leaving entirely, just heading south. Ivan guesses Roadmail and Alan confirms. He plans to retreat to the small southern village of Roadmail in Polarshu territory, where he can live a quiet life, roasting eggs and bread and eating with Ivan. 3 days later, Alan returns to the Count's estate, thinking about the latest chaos. He wonders why he's back in this dangerous place again, and why the eldest son is already dead. The cause of death seems to be a blade, and Alan questions who could have taken down Leo. The people around him are clearly frightened, avoiding eye contact and murmuring apologies. Alan is puzzled by the sudden fear. Ivan calls out to him, and Alan turns, asking if he found anything. Ivan hesitates, then suggests that Alan himself might be the one who wiped out Avalon overnight. Alan realizes that everyone else seems to think the same, which explains their terror. He remains silent for a moment, muttering simply, "What?" A while before Alan left for roadmail, they were talking in the carriage. Ivan asked when Alan planned to head for a bigger city, since they were leaving anyway. Alan hesitated, then gave a serious face and said there was a good reason for choosing roadmail. In his head he thought, no, absolutely not, roadmail was the final destination of his plan. He had saved the 5 great sins and prevented the future where the world would be destroyed. Roadmail had no tie to the original story, and there was even a Palarshu villa there. It was the perfect quiet place for a noble to live out an easy life, so he insisted they go. Ivan rolled his eyes and said he wasn't buying that line anymore. Alan always brushed things off like that whenever he was bothered. Alan waved it away and told him to leave it alone. As their carriage pulled away, one of the sons watched them and debated whether to have Alan taken out. He figured Alan was useless either way and had once considered poisoning him after their father's death. But since Alan claimed he was quietly leaving for the frontier, the son saw no reason to kill him. He suspected Avalon's troubles made things messy and muttered that Alan was just annoying. Then he ordered Elman to follow the carriage from behind. Elman, who'd been mindless in carrying out orders until now, surprised Leo by asking if this meant he was supposed to take Alan down. Leo snapped that Elman's job was simply to obey, but before Leo could react, Elman turned on him. Confused and betrayed, Leo demanded to know how Elman could do this. Elman answered that he enjoyed war games and that it had been fun so far. It turned out Elman, who had been acting like Leo's lackey, was actually one of the children Alan had saved years before, and now he was a Blue Moon operative. Elman explained that they followed a creed taught by the Red Moon and moved according to his will, but they were permitted to act independently if anyone tried to harm the Great Moon. He'd been waiting for the chance to hear those words from Leo. It had taken 2 years, but the moment came. Leo insisted his subordinates would not stand for this betrayal, but Elman called Haydn forward. Haydn declared that with Leo's recent words, Avalon would be erased from the continent forever, and that it was a pity, because the Great Moon had given Leo a chance. Later, Alan woke up in Roadmail and greeted the morning. Roadmail really was paradise for him. Peaceful days, waking and eating whenever he liked, the easy life he'd planned for. Alan was finally able to enjoy a truly aristocratic life, thinking whimsically about starting a toast business. But Ivan interrupted, telling him that a telegram had arrived. Alan immediately wanted to know what it said. The telegram revealed that following Leo Palarshu's death, something had changed. Shocked, Alan realized that his brief taste of paradise had ended in just 3 days. He was back at the Palarshu estate. He still wondered why everyone was reacting to him the way they did. Ivan explained that since Leo had been murdered after Alan left, he had become the heir with a perfect alibi. Avalon was destroyed too, leaving no loose ends. As a result, Alan had unintentionally become the mastermind of the Count's family, commanding assassins at the Swordmaster level. Confused and frustrated, Alan asked why this was happening and muttered about the strange clothes he now wore. He thought to himself that there shouldn't be any organization capable of wiping out an underworld powerhouse in an instant. Recalling Ivan's earlier mention of an organization that hunts at dawn, Alan asked if he meant the Blue Moon. Ivan said that, according to the Information Guild, it was probably not them. Blue Moon operatives always left a sigil, but Avalon had been struck down by swords, leaving behind imagery reminiscent of hell. Alan realized that this explained how he had suddenly become a sword master-level mastermind. In his mind, he noted that Blue Moon had never appeared in the original game, so the culprits couldn't be weaklings who vanished before the story began. He wondered who could possibly have done it. Meanwhile, Yusha asked if there were any traces of the attackers. Everyone shook their heads. One person added that there was nothing left at all, while another girl giggled, remarking that it was just a huge mess to clean up. Another operative arrived, reporting that the remaining Avalon forces numbered 486. He explained that they had split the troops in half and successfully taken taken them down. Yusha nodded in approval, saying it was perfect. Just like that, Avalon, the massive organization that had dominated the Asteria Kingdom, was reduced to dust in just 5 days. However, the operative added that the cleanup wasn't completely finished. Yusha asked what he meant, and he explained that they had discovered additional nobles entangled with Avalon. The Altair Duchy, in particular, appeared to be deeply involved. Yusha examined the documents and looked at the team, asking rhetorically if they already knew what she intended to do. Everyone else, fully prepared, assured her that they would handle it quietly. With everyone else ready, Yusha finally let out a sigh of relief and asked if the Information Guild was keeping things under control. One of the operatives confirmed that the guild was treating the incident as unrelated to Blue Moon. Another added that all guilds were doing the same, referring to the chaos as the hellscape forged by the Swordmaster. Yusha asked if they were still monitoring movements, and the team assured her that they would continue. She reminded them that this matter must never reach Alan, repeating instructions she had given countless times. One of the kids hesitated, noting that since Alan's own blood had acted first, but a voice immediately corrected him, saying that this wasn't an order. They were the sword, and a sword doesn't act on its own. Blue Moon only moves under direct command. He knows everything, don't ever let him down. The kid didn't say anything aloud but thought to himself in disbelief, wondering how someone as overwhelmingly powerful as Yusha could feel anxiety or fear simply because she might be discovered. Still, he spoke, saying he understood. The group collectively affirmed that everything they did was for the Great Moon. For him. Meanwhile, Alan was mentally exhausted. He muttered to himself that he couldn't keep up anymore. After the funeral, he had been swamped for an entire month. All he wanted was to eat and laze around the proper life of a noble. He reflected that he had made plenty of enemies, and that Leo's death was supposed to happen 6 years later. Now, because the deaths of his brothers had altered the game's timeline, all the family affairs fell on him, the heir. Everyone around him was lined up, calling out, "Young master!" Alan thought bitterly about why everyone was suddenly working so hard when, under the count, they had always slacked off. He realized it was fear. They were thinking, is he angry? I don't want to die. Better work harder. Rumors about him being the dark mastermind had clearly spread. Alan wished people would just handle things on their own, but Ivan interrupted, addressing him as young master. Ivan marveled at Alan's talent, noting that reaching the second circle after only 2 years of self-study was astonishing. Normally, it took about 4 years with guidance, and magic couldn't even be used without innate talent. Alan, exhausted, could only think about how overwhelming his position had become. Alan murmured that he wasn't doing too badly, thinking to himself that he'd been practicing hard lately, mostly for self-defense now that things had gotten tense. He reflected that the technique required fine control over mana, but half of it still felt unfinished. He couldn't help but marvel that he was actually using magic in a fantasy world. At first, it had been exciting, but now he realized that once his plans were complete, there wouldn't be any more danger, and he could slow down his self-study. Then the harsh truth struck him. His mana hole was ridiculously small. He muttered in frustration, comparing it to an athlete's natural physique, and noted that his tiny mana hole couldn't be improved with training. Still, he reminded himself that there might be a last resort solution. Ivan then mentioned that Alan had finally received an invitation to the ball. Alan echoed the thought, slightly distracted, and later, at the Southern Asteria Kingdom's Noble Networking Ball, he sighed that he was already tired. Since he was about to become a count, Alan figured he should use the opportunity to build connections. Ivan asked what he was doing, and Alan explained, in his own mind, that he was quietly cultivating ties for a peaceful future. Yet everywhere he went, nobles looked terrified and scattered. Alan, a bit upset, noted that it was exactly what he had expected. He told Ivan he'd be back and mused that the current Palarshu family, known as the Eastern Degenerates, would look down on him as unrefined. But he had a plan. He would charm them with his secret social skills. He examined a glass of wine, admiring its distinctive aroma and unique flavor, and thought about taking a few bottles home. Despite his happy-go-lucky efforts, everyone still looked at him with fearful eyes. Alan kept his smooth smile, believing it essential for socializing. But when a lady screamed and ran, insisting she'd ask her father to prepare some immediately, Alan raised his hands and muttered that wasn't what he meant. Alan muttered to himself that things weren't going as planned. Around him, Nobles whispered among themselves, claiming he was worse than his brothers, saying he had just threatened a lady into giving up a limited edition wine. Ivan only laughed at the ridiculous rumors while Alan stayed silent, convincing himself that maybe the lady had simply been shy. Ivan began listing off Alan's so-called spoils with teasing amusement: a Paldion thoroughbred horse, Pinia tangerine tea, Bilanda forged metal, and Melanciono specialty wine. He remarked that it was quite the collection. Alan, however, only felt deflated. He had even studied wine etiquette diligently, but it turned out the Pilarsha family had an even worse reputation than he'd realized. After rumors spread that he had taken down his delinquent brothers, everyone began avoiding him entirely. So much for networking. If anything, the distance between him and the others had only grown. Deciding to clear his head, Alan told Ivan he was going to get some air. Ivan simply nodded. Outside, Alan leaned against a railing and wondered where everything had gone wrong. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out to him, politely asking if she could have a moment of his time. Alan blinked in disbelief. Someone had actually spoken to him? When he turned around, he found a young woman standing there. She introduced herself as Loria, the third daughter of the Duke of Altia. Alan immediately recognized the name. The Altia family, one of the three great shadow powers of psychedelica, infamous as the Northern Degenerates. He thought to himself that, naturally, anyone who dared approach him couldn't possibly be normal. Still, he couldn't recall her from the game story and wondered why. Loria didn't waste time. Looking directly at him, she said that she needed his help because she was going to be assassinated soon. Alan was a little puzzled at first, listening as Loria explained her situation. Her father, the Duke of Altia, had fallen critically ill, leaving her without the protection she once enjoyed. It was, he admitted, quite a dire predicament. He couldn't help but think that this sort of setup usually led to the two characters ending up together. Yet, as he tried to recall, nothing about Loria's name or story rang a bell. She must be a new addition, someone introduced outside the events of the original game. Loria, however, seemed completely sincere. She begged Alan for protection and even went as far as to offer him half of the Altia family's holdings in return. But Alan only gave a faint, awkward smile and told her he would be heading back. Inwardly, he thought that while her situation tugged at him, he could barely manage his own survival, let alone someone else's. Despite the rumors of his terrifying power, he knew the truth. He wasn't capable of much. Loria's face fell instantly, her expression sinking into despair. Something about the sight stirred Alan's conscience. Just as he turned to leave, he glanced back at her and offered a small reassurance, saying something good would surely happen. In his mind, he added a quiet thought, that he hoped she'd find a better helper than him. Then, with that, he left her behind and returned to the ball. Somewhere else, word of this encounter reached Yusha. A messenger relayed that Altia has approached the Great Moon, and Yusha ordered the information passed to the Red Moon as well, remarking that something favorable might come of it. Another operative agreed, noting that as long as the intel was correct and the Altia family wasn't connected to Avalon, they wouldn't become a target for Radan's operations. They also discussed maintaining control over the information flow, ensuring that the details of the Avalon incident never reached him. Meanwhile, Alan remained completely unaware of the shadows surrounding him. As he lingered near the ballroom's edge, another lady greeted him out of nowhere. Caught off guard, Alan blinked. Was she really speaking to him again? Determined not to waste this chance, he decided that this time he would actually manage to make friends among the nobles. He smiled and greeted her back politely, but when he got a proper look at her face, something about it made him freeze. Recognition hit him. It was the same face he had seen in the game. The lady only laughed lightly, while Alan stood there confused, thinking that perhaps this world still held more surprises than he'd anticipated. Alan senses that whoever dares to approach him first can't possibly be an ordinary noble. He walks closer, greeting her politely and saying she must be young Zenonia. The lady looks amused and asks if he knows her. Alan nods, explaining that she's quite well known. In Asteria, there are three major dark circles: Altia of the north, Pilarshu of the east, and the western scoundrel, Zenonia. Zenonia, the eldest daughter of Count Zenonia Kalia, smiles faintly and says she didn't realize her reputation had spread that far. Alan can tell she's a clever one, more like a corporate mastermind in noble clothing. He knows someone like her could be useful, but all he wants is a quiet life free of political messes. So, Instead of getting dragged in, he simply compliments her beauty. Zenonia thanks him, her expression unreadable, and then asks if he'd like to talk more. Alan hesitates and says he'd love to, but there are too many eyes watching them. Inwardly, he's just praying to get away without starting any trouble. Zenonia smirks and remarks that he's just as the rumors say. Before leaving, she adds that she looks forward to meeting him again. Alan politely agrees, still wondering why she left so suddenly. Meanwhile, hidden in the shadows, unseen figures whisper to one another. They confirm that information about the Avalon incident remains securely blocked, but they also express concern that something seems to be watching their movements. They decide to stay on alert. No new orders have come in, so for now, they'll just observe and be ready to act. Elsewhere, Ivan nervously asks Alan if this really is the canyon he's been searching for, because it looks like walking straight into death. Even in daylight, the place is eerily dark. Alan, however, feels a strange excitement. He's finally found what he's been seeking, his true purpose. The field effect matches what he remembers from the game, confirming that this is the right place. After 2 failed attempts, he's relieved that this one feels real. It was said to be easy to find in the game, the Labyrinth of Whispers, a hidden dungeon in the southern region. The real reason Alan came all this way, under the pretense of attending a noble ball, was to locate this labyrinth. Inside are 8 puzzle chambers, each guarding rare artifacts. Alan has memorized every strategy and walkthrough from his gaming days. As he stands before the dark entrance, he can almost feel the game's atmosphere surrounding him. He takes a breath, thinking that no matter how many times he's seen this place in the game, seeing it in real life feels completely different. Ivan looks utterly confused as he stares into the dark valley. Alan examines the surroundings and calmly says that even the inside of the canyon looks artificial, as if someone deliberately built it that way. Ivan frowns and asks how Alan could possibly know such a thing. Alan, caught off guard, mutters that he's been here often. Ivan immediately reacts in disbelief, asking what he means by that. Alan quickly backtracks, pretending he was just daydreaming, then laughs it off and says there's a way forward and they should get going. Ivan sighs and tells him not to joke with that expression. It's honestly too creepy. As they step deeper inside, strange wailing sounds echo through the chamber. Alan and Ivan watch in shock as twisted creatures cry out, only to be crushed mercilessly by a massive monster lurking within the labyrinth. Soon, they reach a hand-shaped structure, its fingers curled like a riddle waiting to be solved. Ivan warns that if they answer incorrectly, the punishment will be severe. Alan stays silent, lost in thought, analyzing every clue. Ivan watches him nervously, realizing that even in such a terrifying situation, Alan's face remains calm, almost unnervingly so. He starts wondering how his young master always manages to know so much. They've been together for 4 years, yet Ivan still can't figure him out. His mind fills with questions, from the strange missions they've done, like removing evil tissue, paying off debts, rescuing orphans, or chasing meaningless rumors. None of it connects. Nothing makes sense. He silently thinks, how can he know everything about this place when he barely ever leaves the mansion? Alan eventually breaks the silence, saying he's solved the riddle, but that the mechanism will only open once the final sequence finishes. Ivan, still full of doubts, follows him anyway, because somehow things always turn out fine when Alan's involved. Finally, the massive door creaks open. Alan feels a wave of nausea as he steps inside, realizing just how brutal the scene before him is. Even though he knew what to expect, the reality still makes him sweat. Ivan, on the other hand, sighs in relief and says that it must finally be over. They spot a black ring lying in the center of the chamber. Ivan picks it up uncertainly and asks if this was really what they came for. It looks far too useless to be worth all that effort. Alan takes a brief look, notes that it's larger than expected, and tells him to leave it there, warning that taking unnecessary things only invites trouble. Yet inside, Alan feels a quiet satisfaction. He's finally unlocked the restrictions. As they turn to leave, he reassures Ivan that the path back will be safe. Ivan nods hesitantly, still unnerved but trusting him as always. For Alan, the whole labyrinth was straightforward. Every step, every riddle, every danger, all predictable thanks to the walkthrough he remembers from the game. Ivan calls out to his master in alarm, pointing out that the pile of stones ahead isn't just debris, it's a golem coming to life. He senses that Alan hadn't planned for this, and a wave of unease hits him. In his mind, Ivan thinks that the worst kind of opponent is one they don't understand. He tries to figure out a way to get the young master out before things go bad. But Alan, calm as ever, steps forward and tells Ivan that he'll handle it this time. The confidence in his tone completely throws Ivan off. He quickly argues that escaping should be the priority, warning that with only second-tier magic and limited mana, Alan doesn't stand a chance against something like that. Yet Alan doesn't respond, Instead, he starts enforcing the restrictions. In an instant, a violent surge of energy floods the air, accompanied by a blinding flash. A deep, otherworldly voice fills the darkness, speaking of fragments of Nyarlathotep's great will and two constraints that can be enforced. Ivan shields his eyes from the light, struggling to even stand straight, while Alan remains perfectly still, his hand extended forward. Alan silently recalls that there was a similar sequence in the game, a point where the player had to choose restrictions to gain power. He realizes that this labyrinth's reward, the artifact called restriction, is real. It binds its user through harsh limitations but grants great strength in return. The realization that this isn't a game mechanic anymore sends a chill through him. The ancient voice commands him to speak, and Alan does. He states that the use of Babylonian hand seals should be mandatory for casting magic. When the voice asks what he seeks to gain, Alan replies that he wants the power to slightly bend the laws of the world. The voice accepts and grants his wish. Alan feels a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had planned. But the voice speaks again, asking him to continue. Alan adds that the use of magic should be limited only to the great Babylonian incantations. The voice questions what he intends with this condition, and Alan says that his goal remains the same. For a moment, silence falls. The voice stops responding, and the heavy air makes Alan frown. He wonders if he might have done something wrong. He remembers that, in the game, this part involved choosing constraints like the number of people and gear to balance risk and reward. He had memorized it all. Then, the voice returns, deeper and almost reverent this time. It acknowledges his command and calls him a human who remembers the forgotten gods and their mysteries. It thanks him for continuing its will. Alan freezes, confused by the words. He wonders what the voice means by continuing the will. For the first time, he feels a genuine sense of unease, realizing that what stands before him may not just be a remnant of some dungeon's magic, but something far older, something alive. Alan notices the ring vanishing entirely. He realizes that the restriction must have been successfully absorbed. A faint echo lingers in the air, a voice telling him that it will always be watching, calling him the heir of the will. Before he can even process those words, Ivan's panicked voice cuts through the silence. He reminds Alan that, with only second-tier magic, they can't win this fight. The golem is already moving again, its massive body grinding against the canyon floor as it charges forward. Alan steps in front, eyes fixed on the creature. He isn't afraid, he's curious. He raises his hand and begins to gather mana. The air around him crackles, forming the shape of a lightning spear. But even after focusing all his energy, the result is disappointing. The spell that should have shone with brilliance is barely holding together. He realizes, grimly, that this is his limit. No matter how much effort he puts in, his mana capacity is too small. This is as far as he can go with raw training. And that's exactly why he accepted the restrictions, the cost, the risk, the burden. Alan steadies his breathing. He tells himself it's time to test it, to see whether the restrictions truly granted him hope, or if he's still trapped by his weakness. The golem raises its stone arm to strike, and Ivan shouts for him to retreat. But Alan doesn't move. The faint blue lines of the restriction pulse on his arm. If this part hits 2,000 likes, we'll drop the next chapter instantly. The moment it releases,